Dr. Chase Lopez stood close to the shoreline, his rubber boots mere inches from where the inky water lapped like tongues at the sand. To me, it looked as if he was teasing it. The ocean reached, but never quite far enough to touch. Dr. Lopez's face was buried in his cell phone.
"Come look at this, Len,"
he said. I hesitated to duck under the yards of yellow caution tape suspended around the beach, preventing locals and tourists from entering these waters. The stench of it was strong enough from where I stood. Dr. Lopez must have been drowning in it. The smell made the air seem heavy, like you were breathing in something solid. It stuck on my tongue. Metallic. The ocean reeked of blood. It took me time, but I forced myself to walk closer to the source. Dr. Lopez held out his phone to me, and I had to squint and cup my hands over the screen to see it in the sunlight. The chemical analysis of the water, fresh from our main lab.
"Just came in,"
he said.
"and it's not oil. BP lives to see another day."
Then, what the hell is it?
"We don't know."
Dr. Lopez tucked his phone back into his pocket and looked to the ocean.
"Not yet, at least. I'm waiting for more to come through from Maine. That's just preliminary stuff. What does it smell like to you?"
It smells like blood.
"And it's so dark. Could be mass amounts of squid ink, however impossible that may be."
Chemical analysis would have clocked that.
"Right. Well, not much we can really do but wait."
The ocean that stretched out before us was black. With a telescope on the ground and a helicopter in the sky, we could see that this dark patch existed 75 or so feet out from the shore. It was big, but not exactly oil spill big. When the black tide rolled in a few days ago, dead fish and other sea life began to wash ashore. The weird thing about the dead fish was that they didn't rot. By the time we arrived, they had been roasting on the beach for over 2 days. Yet, none of the expected effects of decomposition were present. They were in suspended animation. Dead, but not looking like it. Not even picked apart by gulls or other scavengers. The birds disappeared when the black tide rolled in. We found several species of fish native to this part of the Pacific, a few jellyfish, and one angel shark in the menagerie. They seemed so alive that, at first, we researchers tried to revive them. I put one orange fish inside a tank and was dismayed to find it floated belly up. There it stayed, never decomposing, for the remainder of our time on the island. On our second day there, Dr. Lopez told me that the lab results were inconclusive. What the hell does that mean? Can you at least tell me if it has sodium and chloride in it? It was supposed to be a joke, but Dr. Lopez just shook his head at me.
"No, Len. I'm telling you, they don't know. Whatever it's made of, it's not something we've ever seen before. It's not even blood."
I sat down. I'd never gotten such devastating or exciting news. Something new. Something we could put our names on, but where to begin? How could we possibly know its dangers if we couldn't even tell what it was made of? I didn't know what reaction was appropriate to have. It has to be something, Chase. It came from Earth, didn't it? Maybe it's a chemical runoff that some goddamn plastic company shit out into the ocean. An experimental sort of thing.
They didn't detect any polymers. Not a bad guess, though.
Well, what do we do now? Are they running more tests? Dr. Lopez looked around the tiny space. We occupied a local resort room, which was converted to suit our needs as we did our research. The resort's residents were forced to evacuate when the black tide arrived, being fed bullshit reasons about a chemical spill. There were bunk beds that Dr. Lopez and I shared with 2 others, another marine biologist named Carmen, and an environmental engineer named Gabriel. The local military kept the area in a tight lockdown. No word of this would reach the news.
Maybe we dive,
Dr. Lopez suggested. I blanched. Chase, that substance killed those fish. Whatever it is, it's toxic.
We've got diving suits. It's the 21st century and won't touch our skin.
So we got ready to dive. It wasn't my place to refuse an order from my superior, but I knew that being scared was no viable excuse. Carmen agreed to dive with us, but Gabriel would go no further than the shore. He tagged along to watch from a safe distance. We slipped into diving gear and stood at the edge, just an inch from where the black tide sucked in and out. Carmen shrugged her shoulders at it.
Well, I guess I'll go first, if everyone's gonna be a pussy about it.
She walked out into the ocean. I watched her while holding my breath. I expected her to zip beneath the obsidian surface, pulled to her death by some terrible monster. I expected her to scream as the substance ate through her suit, and ultimately her skin. I expected her to collapse and die like the fish did, silently poisoned. None of this happened. Carmen waded out several yards until she could swim, then dived beneath the water. From the radio, she said,
Come on in, folks. The water's warm.
Dr. Lopez and I followed her. The water was warm. As we sank beneath it, we noticed a peculiar phenomenon. The black tide sat on top of the water, never mixing. It was about 20 inches thick. The temperature difference was notable. The water below, the blackness, was freezing, almost as if it had been siphoned of its heat. I reached my hand into it, and it was a jarring sensation to feel such warmth while the rest of me shivered.
A strange sight indeed.
We were staring upward into space. That's what it looked like to me. If I close my eyes, I can go back to that moment. I'm suspended in the cold ocean, staring up at an inky night sky that blocks out the light of the sun. If I stare long enough, I see little pinpricks of starlight glitter throughout it. It's almost beautiful. It is beautiful. I feel compelled to go into it and remain there in its warm embrace, floating in the atmosphere, stars rippling around me. I started to swim upward. Then, a voice.
Get out of the water,
Gabriel commanded. Dr. Lopez caught my arm, and I came to my senses.
What's up, Gabe?
He asked.
Get out now!
We turned and swam toward the shore. The feeling of coming up through the black tide was indescribable, warm and wonderful. My skin exploded into goosebumps as I emerged from it. I wanted to go back. I was tired. I could sleep in that water. Carmen was the last one to emerge, and she walked backward. She knocked into Dr. Lopez and didn't seem to notice.
Jesus H. Christ!
She said,
What the hell?
I saw it. Saw them. A dozen shark fins slowly moving through the black water toward the shoreline. Each shark's fin was different. The tide gently pushed them ashore in a neat little row, heads facing us and tails toward the sea. There were 12 different species of shark. All of them dead.
Fuck.
Dr. Lopez said.
What are the odds?
The sight struck me numb. This felt purposeful, an arrangement made to be seen. A presentation. I couldn't get any closer. The water didn't feel inviting anymore. It felt hostile. Suddenly, I had the urge to look away from it, as if I had met a stranger's eye for too long.
That's an Atlantic sharpnose.
Carmen pointed at one of them.
How the hell is it here, in the Pacific?
What is that one?
Gabriel asked, pointing at another. This shark was not something I'd ever seen before. It was dark pink, almost red. Adorning its head were small horns arranged like a crown.
It can't be,
Dr. Lopez said. He walked to it and crouched down. Despite our protests, he grabbed the dead shark and inspected its head and the inside of its mouth. His fingers tapped along its teeth like he was a dentist, counting each one aloud, sliding his hand along the gills and peering into its eye. He finally stood, and I saw him trembling as he turned to us.
I could be wrong, but this looks like Hibudus.
A what? I asked.
Opportunistic bugger. Really fast. Lived about 100 million years ago, if I remember correctly. It's been extinct since the late Cretaceous period.
None of us believed him. Carmen was the first to call him crazy. I didn't know much about extinct marine life, but I knew this wasn't possible. It might just look like a hibudus, perhaps a mutated something else. We called for help and lugged the sharp nose and the maybe hibudus back to our makeshift lab. Dr. Lopez called a marine archaeologist and a paleontologist. I went to the bathroom and inspected every inch of my skin. That intoxicating warmth was long forgotten. I was utterly disgusted at the thought of having been in that black water. I expected a red rash, weeping abrasions, and infection, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just my skin. Something strange happened the next day. Gabriel began talking about the black tide like it was a person.
She did that on purpose.
He said at breakfast.
She wanted us to see those sharks.
Who is she?
Carmen asked. She was busy buttering a slice of bread. I watched her do it and noticed there was a minor cut on her pointer finger. Gabriel seemed irritated.
The black water. That was a message to us.
What kind of a message, Gabe?
Carmen taunted.
That it can resurrect sharks from a gazillion years ago? Give me a fucking break.
She's older than us. Much smarter.
They argued and I left. Dr. Lopez's people came later that afternoon with more equipment and knowledge. They fawned over the shark, spent hours alone in a refrigerated room with it, came out and swore to us it's an extinct species. They began calling more people, bigwigs from huge universities. This tide didn't seem like it was ours anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night to find that Gabriel was missing from his bunk. I couldn't go back to sleep. With rising concern, I surmised he may just be using the bathroom, taking a walk, talking to a loved one in a different time zone. But I knew that wasn't the case, so I rose from bed and went to the window. I saw Gabriel on the shore. He was walking toward the tide. Fear gripped me. It was like watching someone standing atop a skyscraper about to jump. Helpless panic. Impending doom. "Chase! Carmen! Wake up!" I shouted. "Gabriel's walking toward the fucking water!"
What?
Carmen groaned. Dr. Lopez rolled over to face the wall. I shook him harder, and he finally sat up.
Len, seriously,
Can we please go check on him? I'm worried. I mean, why is he out there at this hour? Dr. Lopez had been my supervisor for 3 years. Before that, he was my professor and personal advisor. He rarely said no to me. He got out of bed and followed me out of the resort and toward the black tide. The moon was full, and the beach was illuminated in pale blue. As we approached, I noticed that the light didn't reflect off the surface of the black water. It was consumed by it, like a void. It had been different in the sun. The rays reflect back at you, almost blinding. Why should the moonlight be different? Gabriel was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Lopez and I ducked beneath the caution tape and walked as far as we were willing to. The black tide was still. If I didn't know any better, I'd have said it was a solid sheet of blackness lying on top of the ocean. Vanta black. Blacker than black. Black hole. I wanted to touch it, to see if it was the same thing we encountered in the daylight or if something else had replaced it. Then Gabriel appeared. He was floating face down in the void, several yards from the shore. Slowly, his body began to move toward us. He looked like he was in space, a place where there are millions of light years between stars and planets, and there's absolutely no light. Just his partially submerged body, suspended in eternity, moving forward with such ease and purpose that there could have been a conveyor belt beneath him. My body felt drained of its blood. I was cold with fright. When I moved toward the water, Dr. Lopez grabbed me.
"Don't,"
he whispered.
"Don't go in there."
Gabriel's body stopped floating toward us. It was frozen in the blackness, like a movie on pause. We stayed where we were, and I felt sick enough to puke. We can't leave him there.
"I think."
Dr. Lopez started, then paused. I could hear him swallow.
"I think it wants us to go in."
Gabriel's body reanimated and floated backward, away from the shore. I was disgusted with myself for not going after him. What if he's still alive? Not yet drowned? He floated back several more feet, stopped, and then started toward us again. I knew what Dr. Lopez meant now. These aren't the movements of the natural current. These movements are deliberate, teasing, controlled. Gabriel got close enough to the shore that we could touch him. With hubris, I crouched down and reached for his arm. Dr. Lopez jerked me away just as Gabriel zipped backward and slipped beneath the surface, blinked out of existence. TV turned off. We fell into the sand and scrambled away from the water's edge. Hot tears filled my eyes. Dr. Lopez was silent. We waited, unable to move. A few yards out, Gabriel's body appeared again, static in the void. In the daylight, we pulled Gabriel out using lifeguard equipment. He was dead, but he looked alive, asleep. When the paramedics put him on a stretcher, inky liquid spilled from his lips. We all jumped away from it. One paramedic cursed as they started to take him toward the ambulance, where a medical doctor would pronounce him dead at the hospital.
"We can't allow this."
Dr. Lopez hissed. He ran after them.
"Wait. We must keep the body here. The water may be infected, and it wouldn't be safe to take him to a hospital full of compromised people."
I knew what he was doing because I thought the same thing. I wanted to see if Gabriel's body was going to decompose. Carmen was oddly stoic when I gave her the news about Gabriel. She said something strange that made me uneasy.
He answered her call.
Perhaps she was making fun of him for the previous day's conversation, which seemed cruel even for gruff Carmen. As I sat with her, I noticed the cut on her finger was redder, inflamed. "What's up with your hand?" I asked. She hid it between her thighs.
Paper cut. It's been itchy, so I made it worse.
I wondered if she had that cut when we went diving. Somehow, Dr. Lopez convinced the paramedics to leave Gabriel's body with us. We took him wrapped in a body bag to the refrigerated room where we laid out some sharks and other dead things. He mentioned something about his pockets being lighter now, and I understood. Bribing a paramedic to leave our dead colleague's body here for us to study. Is this what we had come to? It was insanity. But at least Dr. Lopez succeeded in preventing any information leaks to the public. A tech from the main lab called us not long after we stored Gabriel in the room.
Have you noticed the phenomenon evaporating or dissipating at all?
No, it's still there. Nothing has changed as far as we can see.
Weird. All the samples you sent us are gone.
What do you mean, gone?
Well, it's gone. Completely vanished overnight. Now all we have are tubes of plain old Pacific Ocean water. We can't find a trace of the stuff anywhere.
I didn't know what to make of it. Neither did Carmen or Dr. Lopez. For the first time in my career, I felt stupid. More than that, I felt gullible, like I'd been tricked here on a wild goose chase. Paranoia compelled me to go back to the shore and see if the substance was still there. It was. We were stuck, unable to categorize the black tide, unable to make sense of the dead but not decomposing corpses, and unable to find answers. After the accident, it felt wrong to get close to it anyhow. Dr. Lopez didn't want to discuss the events of Gabriel's death with me, yet he had been the one to ascribe malicious intention to the water that night. Told me that it wants us to go in. And I believed him. Still do. Sometime later, Carmen amputated her hand. I found her on the floor in the bathroom, curled into a ball, soaked in blood. So much blood I thought she couldn't possibly have any left in her body. Somewhere in the mess was a hammer she'd used to break her wrist, and the saw that had done most of the deed. However, Carmen underestimated how difficult it would be to amputate a limb by herself. As I pried her arms apart, I saw her hand was still attached to her arm, if only by scraps of flesh and frayed tendons.
It got inside of me.
She wept.
I had to get it out.
Dr. Lopez wouldn't allow me to call the paramedics again. He put the little resort into lockdown. The archaeologist and paleontologist left despite his warnings, no doubt shaken by the recent death and mutilation. They would come back for the shark when the others arrived. I secured a tourniquet on Carmen's arm while Dr. Lopez removed the rest of her hand. We bandaged her, but she was catatonic. "Chase, we have to get her to a fucking hospital," I begged. "She needs a transfusion. She'll die."
We can't risk it,
he said. Dr. Lopez dropped the severed hand into a Tupperware container.
We don't know what the tide could do if it got out.
Got out? It's not some contagious disease.
We don't know what it is, Len.
Carmen never fully regained consciousness. Dr. Lopez took my phone when I was tending to her, leaving me unable to call for help even if I wanted to. I was terrified now, not just of the black tide, but of my supervisor. He was changing, paranoid, shifty. He spent nearly all day inside the fridge with the specimens. That night, I went out alone to the shore. I sat on the sand and watched the black tide sit motionless on the water, absorbing light, so dark it seemed biblical. I stared into the abyss for an eternity, waiting for something to be revealed to me, some divine vision. Pinpricks of light, just like the ones I had seen several days ago when we took our first dive. They came into view slowly, blanketing the tide with the night sky once more. Each one's luminosity ebbed and flowed like heartbeats. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I was sitting on the edge of a planet, gazing out into infinite space.
Len!
Dr. Lopez had come for me. I think it was to prevent me from escaping, to call for help. But he unknowingly saved my life instead. I snapped out of my dreadful trance and got to my feet. The stars were gone, and it remained as I'd seen it before. No longer beautiful, but repulsive in its vastness. Those stars must have been what Gabriel saw before he walked into the void. We went back inside, and he admonished me.
Think of what happened to Gabriel,
He said.
Do you want that to be you?
There's something wrong with it.
I know there is.
Then we heard it. Thumping. Rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Coming from the fridge. Dr. Lopez and I approached it cautiously, standing in front of the door. I realized that the thumping was coming from lower, down on the thick door, perhaps just a foot or so off the ground. What is that?
I don't know.
Too terrified to open the door, we retreated to our beds. But the thumping continued throughout the night. Hours and hours I couldn't sleep, waiting for the sun to rise and make everything seem less frightening. It was nearly 5 a.m. when Dr. Lopez rose and declared enough was enough.
We're scholars, goddammit, and we're acting like children.
Chase, wait, I pleaded. He was right. We were like two kids afraid of the closet. We were scientists, doctors. The black tide didn't have thoughts or feelings. Gabriel drowned, and Carmen was mentally ill. There was an explanation for everything if he looked hard enough. We stood outside the fridge's door again, listening to the thump, thump. I stood behind Dr. Lopez as he reached for the handle and opened the door. Gabriel, naked on his hands and knees, continued to thrust his head into the space where the door had been. The top of his skull was bloody from hours of impact. The realization hit me like a brick to the face. He's alive! Dr. Lopez didn't move.
He can't be.
One shark fell from a shelf and flopped helplessly on the floor. Another followed. Then all the fish began to move. The room full of dead things animated, and they were all alive once more despite being out of water for several days. Wet slapping filled the air. Even the hibiscus was alive, wriggling its way toward the open door. Gabriel remained on his hands and knees, but dragged himself forward, head hanging limp between his shoulders as if it were too heavy to lift. A trail of black water dripped from his slack jaw. Dr. Lopez slammed the door on him. "Chase!" I cried. I wept freely now, unable to cope with the sight of the alive dead. "We have to help him! Open the fucking door!"
He isn't alive. None of these things are alive. It's impossible.
I reached for the handle, but Dr. Lopez shoved me away. I stumbled backward and lost my balance, landing hard on the floor. He loomed over me.
Don't you dare.
How can you just leave him in there?
We're going to call the main lab.
Dr. Lopez pulled his phone out and rang the number right there, standing with his back to the fridge. It rang, and rang, and rang. No one answered. He cursed.
What the hell? They're a 24-hour lab, damn it.
He tried again. 3 more times. 2 more. He gave me my cell phone, and I tried them too. The lab didn't answer. Suddenly I felt the weight of our isolation. Gabriel's thumping resumed inside the fridge. The black tide was retreating. Dr. Lopez and I stood alone on the shore, watching the darkness shrink away from us. It was moving, all of it, floating slowly out into the open ocean as one great mass. The smell of blood dissipated as it got further away from the beach. "Where is it going?" I asked. Dr. Lopez shook his head.
I don't know.
We could hear Gabriel and the fish slamming around inside the resort from where we stood. They were louder, more frantic. Gabriel even began to scream, a long, hoarse wailing that filled me with a sense of dread and nausea. It was a mournful cry, something you might hear at a funeral as the casket is lowered into the earth.
I think
Dr. Lopez finally said,
that they want us to go with it.
As the black tide melted into the horizon, I saw the stars glimmer across it once more.